putting a question to me that I'm supposed to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. So first, just before we start, I want to just say welcome to Blue Politics. It's a pleasure to have you on. Just for anyone who might not be as familiar with you as preferable, do you want to give a brief intro about who you are, what you do, and your claim to fame, I suppose?
Are you supposed to be doing that, or am I?
Oh, you. I'm saying, like, would you like to do?
Sure. I'm an academic economist whose doctorate is in theoretical physics. I spent quite a long time being a professor of economics and then a professor of law, because I got into the field of economic analysis of law, of using economics to understand the legal system better. I retired from that a few years ago. What else is of interest? I'm a fairly extreme libertarian. I think the ideal society would have no government at all. And I think that under some but not all circumstances, that would be a stable system. My first book, Machinery of Freedom, which I've even got a copy of right here, if anybody wants to look at it, except that the screen seems to do mirror images. And that book, written about 50 years ago, and in it, one of the things I did was to sketch what a modern society with private property and without government might look like. My most recent nonfiction book is called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And one of the things I discovered in the process of doing the work that led to it is that in my first book, I was reinventing the wheel. That is to say that I was describing a imaginary high division of labor, modern society version of something that had in fact existed in the real world in a variety of places in a much more primitive form. Which I thought was interesting. Essentially a system where law enforcement was private and decentralized. And I have a chapter. The book isn't mainly about that. The book is about a whole bunch of different interesting societies and how their legal systems work, to include, I guess, the earliest two are Imperial China and Periclean Athens. And then the modern ones are the Amish and the Romani, which still are out there. Other than that, I've published 3 novels, of which the first one was marketed by Bain as a fantasy, but it was really a historical novel with made-up history and geography. And the second and third were self-published, and they really are fantasies. I could talk about those if people are curious. Like most writers, I'm always happy to talk about my stuff. Other than that, I have a blog called Ideas, which is whatever I feel like talking about. I find blog very neat from that standpoint. A while back, I decided I didn't have any new ideas for another book. So instead, I compiled all of my blog posts, sorted them by subject, and I'm in the process of writing book chapters, each chapter based on 1 or 2 or 3 of my blog posts and some of the comments to it. And what I did today, for curiosity, was to do a word count on the amount of that I had done so far, and it came out to about the same number of words as the 3rd edition of my first book. On the other hand, I'll probably decide to throw away some of those chapters when I finish going at the end, because it'll turn out that not all of them are as interesting as I had hoped they would be. But in any case, I expect that my 15 years of blogs are probably going to turn into something like 2 or 3 books. If people are curious, I've been webbing my drafts as I write them, and the sections I now have up are libertarianism, religion, and education. And that's been sort of interesting and fun. A good many years ago, I signed myself 2 hours a day, 7 days a week on writing projects, because if I spend all my time playing, I get stale and don't like the taste of in my mouth anymore. So I figure about 2 hours a day is enough, so I still have lots of time for reading books and arguing with people online, but it does get something done. What else can I tell you? One of my hobbies for about 50 years has been the Society for Creative Anachronism, which does medieval stuff for fun. I stopped doing sword and shield fighting about 9 years ago because I decided I was too old for that. But I still cook from very early recipes and make medieval jewelry and transportable period furniture and do medieval storytelling. In fact, I'm supposed to be doing a class online tomorrow on how to tell a medieval story in a way that creates the illusion of a medieval storyteller talking to a medieval audience, which is something that I find it fun to do. So that's sort of a very brief survey. I've been married twice. My second marriage has now been going for 30-some years. We have 2 adult children, and I have 1 adult child and 3 grandchildren from my first marriage. And I guess I might as well answer questions.
Okay. No, it's fine. We have quite a few questions about libertarianism and science fiction, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. For everyone else, to put in questions, just join the Blue Politics server and put your questions in Friedman AMA, and you might get them asked. Okay, so our first question comes from Probably Tim, and he's asking, what is the closest we have been to an anarcho-capitalist society in recorded human history?
Yeah, the answer, there would be a number of answers to that. I think northern Somalia, through a good deal of its history, is really the wrong term because they don't have much data on it before, I guess, the late 19th century. But as far as I can tell, that system existed way back. Let's see, what are some other good examples? There was quite a lot of effectively anarcho-capitalism in the early Middle Ages, even though there were kings who claimed certain powers. I've got a quote in my book describing how things worked in practice. What are other examples? The Romani don't really have a government at all. The Romani are what I think of as an embedded legal system, in the sense that there is some government, such as the US government, that's nominally over them, but through a good deal of their history and to some extent still, they've done a pretty good job of staying below the radar of the official scene, and then they have their own mechanisms for enforcing their own rules on each other. So those would be examples. The one I know best is Saga period Iceland, but that's not quite as close because this is Iceland starting in about 930 AD, and the system collapsed in the 1260s, so it lasted for about a third of a millennium. And that was a society where they had a legislature and a law code, but there was no executive arm of government. So all enforcement was private. There was no police force or government or tax system or whatever. And that was the first one I really got interested in. And I wrote an article on that a long, long time ago. And then in the course of doing my legal systems book, I went back to the subject, and it turned out that the most important primary source had finally been translated, so I could read it. And so the chapter in the book expands on the old article and corrects some mistakes in that article. So that one, as I think, is the one that I really know best. Other than that, it's not at all clear. Some people argue that early Ireland was an anarchist society. And the trouble is that we don't really have good sources for the early period. That what we've got are fragments of legal texts embedded in later things, and they may be right or wrong, and they don't all agree with each other. So they certainly show mechanisms for private law enforcement, but they seem to also be showing mechanisms for law enforcement by a king. And it's not clear if these are existing at different times or different places or for different issues or whatever. So although there certainly are people who argue that the Irish system was anarchist, and they might be right, I'm not all that sure. But anyway, if people are interested in these systems, as I say, if you look at my book, Legal Systems, very different from ours. And you can actually, with a little effort, you can find a late draft of it webbed online. And the book itself, you can get the Kindle for, I think, $5 or something, which is what I usually charge for my Kindles. And that has fairly detailed descriptions of all of those systems.
Brilliant. Really good answer. And we have another question here from Connell, who wants to know, what are your thoughts on Ayn Rand and objectivism?
I think Ayn Rand was brilliant, courageous, arrogant, and I think wrong philosophically speaking. That is to say, she makes a very interesting and impressive claim which is that you can rationally derive a system of rights and systems of norms, a system of oughts. And that's a fascinating claim. That's really contradicting Hume's famous is-ought problem. And I don't think it's true. I devote a chapter in the 3rd edition of Machinery to analyzing Rand's argument as she makes it in Atlas Shrugged. In the speech, there's a long speech in Atlas Shrugged, which is sketching out her views. And as far as I can tell, her argument has multiple holes in it, and she covers up the holes with passionate rhetoric, which she's very good at. So I admire Rand. I think she was an original writer, wrote a very odd kind of books, but they sold a lot of copies and persuaded a lot of people. I think many of her views I agree with. Her rejection of anarchy, I disagree with. And as far as I can tell, there's an internal inconsistency. Now, I should say I've never had the chance to argue this stuff with Rand, so I'm going by arguing with various of her followers. Back on Usenet a long time ago, there's probably still a group called Humanities, Philosophy, Objectivism, but I spent lots of time on it 30 years ago or so. And the problem with her, the internal problem with her position, is that she claims that initiating force is wrong. She wants a government. She wants a minarchy, a very minimal government. And the minimal government can't collect taxes because that's an initiation of force. So the minimal government supports itself by selling its services. For example, the service of enforcing contracts. That's her basic argument, as I understand it. And the problem is that in order to get from the service of enforcing contracts the surplus necessary to pay for the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, is going to have to charge a price above cost. And then competing firms will come in and offer to enforce contracts at a lower price. That without a monopoly, it can't expect to get monopoly profits. And the objectivist answer is, they aren't allowed to do that. But then you say, all right, but then you're being internally inconsistent. Either it's true that her government is only engaged in retaliatory force, but if retaliatory force is legitimate, then it's legitimate for people other than her government. So either either it's legitimate to shut down competing rights enforcement agencies, in which case, because retaliatory force is wrong, in which case the government can't do it either, or it's not legitimate, in which case the government is going to face competition. And I've never seen a satisfactory resolution of that problem. So I guess I have two serious disagreements with her, one of which is that her derivation of her moral system, I think, doesn't work. Now, to be fair, that's going from her description in Atlas Shrugged. Maybe if I read some of the current objectivist philosophers, I would find they had a better version, but I'm not holding my breath. And then the second objection is that as far as I can tell, her moral system implies anarchy, but she rejects anarchy. Now, she rejects anarchy as far as I can tell because she hasn't thought about it very carefully. And she therefore makes the standard argument that everybody makes about how if you have private rights enforcement agencies, they'll have to fight each other. And maybe she's right, but that has been discussed at some length by me and by Rothbard and by various other people. And as far as I can tell, she never responded to that. And, it's a pity she's no longer alive because she was a neat person. It would be really fun to be able to argue with her, but I'm afraid that's not an option anymore. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. It does lead into our next question quite well. You've made your stance a bit known already, but Powell wants to know, are market failures and failures evidence that government intervention in the economy is necessary?
Necessary is always too strong a term. Market failures are evidence that a sufficiently competent and benevolent government could improve on the results of laissez-faire. We don't have such a government available. So that I think a point in which I would disagree with some libertarians, though surely not all, I don't think that the laissez-faire system I advocate will do everything right. It is clear market failure is a real problem. Market failure is basically situations where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality. That's the easiest way of thinking about it, I think. And that happens because the individual actor is not bearing most of the cost of his action or is not receiving most of the benefit of his action. The sort of the central logic of decentralized coordination, which is what the market is doing, is you set things up so each individual actor at least roughly bears the net costs of his action. So if my action produces for the entire world a net benefit of $10, I get $10. If it produces a net loss of $10, I lose $10. And now my incentives are perfectly matched with the incentives of the world's population, with the interest of the world's population. That's a simplified version, but I think that's about right. And the problem is that there are lots of situations where that isn't happening. That happens in the sort of ideal economist perfect competition world. But in the real world, sometimes I do something and other people get a benefit I can't collect for. Sometimes I do something that imposes costs on other people they can't charge me for, and therefore my incentives aren't always right. That's the logic of market failure. The problem with using government to substitute for it is that if you think about the logic of government as a decision mechanism, it is much farther from that ideal than the market. That in the market, you will occasionally have a situation, rarely where most of the cost or most of the benefit goes to other people, but sometimes where some of it does. In the political system, it's almost never the case that an individual actor either bears the cost or receives the benefit of his action. So therefore, it's not that what I think of as I'm now forgetting the term, but basically a perfectly wise, benevolent actor couldn't improve things. It's that we don't have any of those. And what we do have is a political mechanism, various different variants of a political mechanism, and there's no reason to expect it to produce the right outcomes. So my answer would be that it's not that market failures aren't a problem, it's that the government isn't a solution. I had an exchange a long time ago with Scott Alexander, and in his FAQ, which was criticizing libertarian, he's got libertarian, something to the effect of, you can't all solve these problems except by government. And my response was the last few words are superfluous because you can't solve these problems either with or without government.
Oh, okay. I think that also leads really well into our next question from MU57, and he's asking that. Well, the question is: in your book *Machinery of Freedom*, you point some glaring flaws with Rothbard's approach to the NAP and private property rights. A common example you cite is whether or not shining a light on someone else should be considered aggression, and what differences sending photons and air pollutants, for instance.
Yeah.
Having said that, where would you draw the line between aggression that is acceptable, like someone else's light shining on someone else's car, and aggression that is unacceptable?
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if that is a question about my moral beliefs or a question about sensible institutions. Because I would have said that, speaking as an economist doing law and econ, it really becomes a question of the costs of the inefficiencies due to people not being liable for something versus the costs of the inefficiencies due to their being liable. So if you take the extreme case, take the case, for example, where I'm not allowed to turn on a light in my house because you can see it, which shows my photons are trespassing. And it's pretty clear that coordinating things so that I got to turn on a light when it was worth doing under those rules would be almost impossible, because everyone, for 10 miles around would have a blocking position. So I would say, on the other hand, if what I'm doing is target practice with a submachine gun in my backyard and I don't have a really good backstop, then it does seem worth it. So I guess I would say that in terms of the institutions I would advocate, that you draw the line at the point where the size of the benefits from giving other people rights over my action is larger than the size of the costs. But I'm afraid I can't really deduce sort of morally right answers to questions. I have moral intuitions, and at one end it feels wrong, and the other end it feels right. But I can only do calculations as an economist.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sure you answered this question to their satisfaction. Our next question comes from Lil Bill, and he wants to know what your biggest criticism of Marxist economics is.
Oh boy. I'm very far from expert on Marxist economics. And when I read Das Kapital a very long time ago, when I was teaching history of thought and we covered it, it seemed to me that Marx had misread Ricardo, which was easy to do, and he thought that Ricardo really had a labor theory of value, whereas what Ricardo had was a simplifying assumption in which the labor input and the capital input were always proportional to each other, in which the ratio of capital labor was always the same for all outputs, for all products. Within that assumption, he then was able to do basically the world's first version of general equilibrium theory, which was very impressive because he didn't have any of the math that any modern economist would tell you is needed to do that job. But he also discusses at the beginning of the book why that's only an approximation, and he tries to estimate how much prices will deviate. And Marx seems to take labor theory of value seriously when he starts, and then partway through Capital, he notices that if prices are actually proportional to labor input, then it will be much more profitable to invest in labor-intensive industries than in capital-intensive industries, and that's inconsistent with equilibrium on the capital market. So that was sort of my initial reaction reading it. And at that point, he says, oh, well, actually, exchange value isn't the price at which things exchange. They exchange at a price which is exchange value modified by essentially Ricardo's initial point of why the approximation wasn't right. So that sort of seemed to me crazy. But I gather, I mean, beyond that, I guess I'm not really an expert in Marxist economics. Economics has gone a long way doubtless since Marx, and it's not something where I'm in a good position to critique it. Now, part of the sort of Marxist intuition seems to be the idea that capital isn't productive, and I think that's not true. And I think the neoclassical economists explain that point pretty well, that it is costly to postpone consumption, which you have to do in order to accumulate capital. You can sometimes produce more stuff if you can pay for it before you get it, so to speak. That is, if you have somebody to invest in it, if you plant apple trees and then can wait 20 years for your harvest. Therefore, since capital is both costly to produce and productive, thinking of the return of capital as if it's somehow stolen money doesn't make any sense to me. But beyond that, I think I'd have to have a particular Marxist making particular arguments before I could respond to them.
All right. This is quite a long question, so sorry for that. But this one comes from Fairy Glock. Your father and Hayek had a very direct impact on the transformation of China's adoption of free market principles, which spurred China's rapid growth to where it stands now. However, government influence in China seems to have struck a balance between allowing for private property while heavily influencing the direction of capital investment to an extent that it's hard to call China a free market economy. Does their growth indicate proof that individual economic freedom and centrally planned economies can coexist, in contrast to your father's assertions? Or perhaps is their growth merely an appendage of the American free market and still indirectly dependent on a free market in which China participates in due to their ever-increasing globalization of trade markets?
Yeah, I would suggest to begin with that the best thing I've read on China is Ronald Coase's final book, which he co-authored with Ning Wang, which is called How China Went Capitalist. And part of what's intriguing about that is that he argues that now this was written, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. So, and of course, he's no longer alive to correct it, although his co-author, I guess, is. But at that point, he thought that China did better sort of inventing capitalism for themselves by trial and error than if they had done it based on the instructions from American economists, whether they were from Harvard or from Chicago. And that's quite an interesting discussion. I've actually got a long review of that book, which I really ought to web because I think I'm allowed to web it now. It's been more than a year since it was published. But in any case, beyond that, China started with a whole lot of intelligent, hardworking people, and extraordinarily poor due to a very badly designed economic system. And they had the advantage that they could copy all sorts of technologies and stuff from the rest of the world. Those were pretty freely available. And they therefore grew very, very quickly. But I know my father's view, at least, was that which he discusses in my parents' autobiography, Two Lucky People, was that the first Chinese president he talked with, who was the one who then fell from power, I think because he objected to the Tiananmen massacre, if I remember correctly, he thought understood economics, had good economic intuitions of doing it right. And the second one, and this was a while ago, so I'm not sure if it's the one who's still in power or not, he thought did not understand it, believed that the government could sort of decide things, and didn't see why they couldn't. So, my guess is that China would be better off if the first one had stayed in power instead of what actually happened. I'm not really sure how much real direction there is in China. That there's a tendency for sensible governments to take credit for anything good that happens, just like other people. My impression, at least when I was in Shanghai, was that it was somewhat less capitalist than an American city on paper, and probably somewhat more capitalist in practice. That there were regulations, but they weren't getting enforced, probably because people bribed the people who were supposed to enforce them. Now, Shanghai is probably more free market, more of a capitalist system than the average Chinese city, from what I can tell. But certainly the Communist Party intervenes in lots of stuff. But anyway, part of what was interesting about Kosa's book is that the situation as he saw it was that when Mao died, the elite of China were finally able to go out of the country. And they were all sort of believers in socialism. They thought they had the world's best economic system. And they go out of the country and discover they're one of the poorest countries in the world. There is a vice premier of China who visits England. And his report is England would be the perfect communist country if only had a communist party in charge of it. And that was after he discovered that a trash collector in London had 4 times his income. So the result of that was that they said, we're sure socialism is still right, but we must be doing socialism wrong. Let's figure out. And in particular, the critical decision was not to suppress experiment, so that the more or less privatization of land was something that was illegal when it happened, was concealed when it happened in a number of different villages. When it became public, it was clear that it was working very well. And so the government said, well, this is still illegal, but we're not going to punish you. And then a little while later, the government said, well, in places where the present system is working really badly, you're allowed to do this instead. And then after all, the government said everybody should do this. So that was really a case. And there were a number of, it's one of the interesting things in the Coase book, the number of places where most of what happened was not the government deciding to innovate, but innovation happening and the government not stepping on it, basically. So anyway, but I think China would be doing better if the government interfered less, but it's still doing pretty well. Much, much better than it was 50 years ago.
Brilliant. I'm sure Glock's very happy with that answer. You gave quite a lot of detail. Our next question comes from Whiskey. Glock gave it a thumbs up. Whiskey asks, in the early 2000s and 90s, we saw a rise of individualism and an empowerment of the individuals in the Western capitalist democracies. Currently, it seems like populism is on the rise. Why do you think that is? And do you think the current
2090s? You mean the 1990s?
No, yeah, 2000s and 90s. Sorry, I think I skipped over the and. Yeah.
In the 2000 and the 90s, that capitalism was a rising tide, and at the moment, it is being threatened from both sides.
Yes.
That is, at the moment, both the idea of socialism, or at least the word socialism, is becoming more popular, certainly in the U.S., and at the same time, you've got nationalists who are in favor of restricting immigration and restricting trade and a bunch of other things. So I think that's a correct description of what's happening, unfortunately. My feeling in this last election was that we were damned either way. The only question was which bad outcome we were going to have, a loose cannon who wasn't predictable or somebody who was predictably going to do the wrong things. And we got the latter, and I'll wait and see. Maybe we'll be lucky. But anyway, but I'm not sure I understand the question. That is the question, why did that change happen?
Yeah, why do you think this is the case, and do you see the trend changing?
I don't know. Prophecy, I'm not good at. I think that there are a number of sets of ideas that are important for a functioning society, which are hard to maintain. And one of them is sort of free speech and toleration, because it is always very tempting to say, look, speech has effects. People get killed because the wrong things have been said and the wrong ideas are spread. And you have a Holocaust or Holodomor or something like that. So therefore, we ought to suppress bad speech. It's easy for people to say, well, obviously my views are right. And of course, reasonable disagreement is fine, but your disagreement must be unreasonable because I know I'm right. And people have a tendency to talk to other people who agree with them and tell them, yes, indeed, you're right. And similarly for the market, understanding why a free market is a good idea is a non-trivial problem. That if you think about foreign trade, the relevant economics were worked out just about 200 years ago by Ricardo. He was right. I think most modern economists say the core idea of principle of comparative advantage was right. But it's much harder to understand than the principle of absolute advantage, which holds that if we're better at producing stuff, we sell stuff to you and we get rich with your money. And if we're worse, you sell stuff to us and you get rich with our money. And there are two mistakes in that. First, the idea of an absolute better or worse. And second, the idea that having money comes in makes your country rich. You can't eat dollars. But those are sort of plausible, convincing mistakes, which is why those were the accepted views 210 years ago. And why, if you watch public discussions of trade policy, most of them are 200 years out of date, because the wrong ideas are easier to make sense of than the right. So I guess I would have said that the first question is how we managed to have a decent system working for a while. And I don't know what the answer to that is or how we can get it back. I'm not too optimistic, but I'm not strong on prophecy.
Okay, that's fine. Our next question, I'm going to jumble their name, but JMB6G, they ask, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies?
I think Bitcoin was a brilliant idea. I was writing about anonymous digital currencies well before Bitcoin. And the anonymous currencies I was thinking of were basically Xiaomi and digital cash, which is a procedure by which you have a bank that issues money in such a way that individuals can make payments online without either payer or payee knowing who the other one is, and without the bank knowing who either of them is. So it was a fully anonymous system for making payments. And that never came into existence. And the reason it never came into existence, in my opinion, is that to do it, you had to have an issuing bank. The issuing bank had to be in some reasonably respectable kind of country so people would trust it to have their money. And all of the respectable countries were against such a thing, because you have an anonymous digital currency, it becomes impossible to enforce money laundering laws. And that significantly reduces the power of government to enforce its rules. I was just reading something that Janet Yellen had said in an interview about her views on cryptocurrencies, and she thinks, yes, they could be valuable, but look, they might let people do things that the government can't see. I regard that as a plus, but she obviously regards it as a minus. Now, Bitcoin in particular, unfortunately, Bitcoin itself is not a very good substitute for ordinary money. Its value changes quite a lot from time to time. On average, it goes up, but nonetheless, you'd like to be able to state a price for your goods and not have to revise the price every 3 days. So in that sense, it's much more convenient if you have a money whose purchasing power is reasonably stable. And I gather there have been some projects which I haven't followed that are trying to create stable coins. I have one blog post a while back on my blog in which I sketched out a way in which you could maintain a coin, a cryptocurrency with a constant exchange rate to the dollar, or to the euro, but I was assuming a dollar. And I think there are ways you could do that. Also, none of the current cryptocurrencies, as far as I can tell, are fully anonymous. Bitcoin is in some ways the world's least anonymous currency, since every transaction is public information to everybody who's using Bitcoin. On the other hand, what's public information is a transaction between accounts, not between people. So in principle, you could try to conceal what's going on by having multiple accounts and doing various more complicated things. A couple of years ago, I think, I was at a conference on this sort of stuff where people were allowed to invent their own sessions. And I had a session on anonymous cryptocurrencies. And there were people there from both of the groups that were trying to create anonymous digital currencies. And some of you may remember the names of those. I don't at the moment, though I probably recognize them. And both of them agreed that they couldn't make it perfectly anonymous, that an observer who was willing to spend enough resources trying to figure out who you were would be able to trace payments, that all you could do is make it really hard. Now, that may be enough, but it would be nice if somebody could get a fully anonymous system. And I think that Xiaomi and digital cash would have been, but as I say, that has the problem that it then needs an issuer.
Okay, another question from Whiskey. Given the disaster that is quantitative easing, some have begun supporting a standardized currency without the government being able to engage in monetary policy. What is your opinion on that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. My view of the right way, putting aside the question of cryptocurrencies, my view of the right way to do money is to have competing private issuers, and that the private issuers should be issuing a fractional reserve money where the reserve commodity is something very stable. And the ideal way of doing that is that your reserve commodity is not a single commodity, but a commodity bundle. That you say, all right, if you bring in $1 million Friedman dollars, we will give you 1 ton of grade A steel and 43 bushels of grade B wheat, and you have a bundle which has got a sufficient mix of different commodities so that you would expect the real value of that bundle to be pretty constant. Now, that means that if I issue too many Friedman dollars and the prices in Friedman dollars of those things go up, it pays people to bring in their $1 million, take the commodities, sell them, and make money. If I issue too few Friedman dollars and the dollars become more valuable and therefore the prices go down, now I say to myself, aha, I could issue some more money and collect the interest on the goods I buy with that money, and it would still stay in circulation. So that would be my preferred system. And except for the commodity bundle, this is not an imaginary system. This is roughly what Scottish banking was when Adam Smith was writing. That is, there were private issuers. Theirs was based on silver, not on a commodity bundle, but it was a private competing fractional issue system.
Great. If you don't mind, I will switch to a few science fiction questions just to take a bit of a break from the libertarian questions.
Of course.
Willie says, considering you're a sci-fi fan, have you watched Star Trek Picard? If so, what do you think of it?
I have not. I watched a good many of the original Star Trek. I'm a science fiction fan. I'm not a television fan. I don't, in fact, watch television at all. Haven't for many years. I concluded quite a long time ago that the people who do television programs are very good at getting your attention, and I had better things to do with my time. And my impression is that, as a rule, written science fiction is usually better than television, and probably better than movie science fiction. So I read quite a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I'm currently reading, I think for the 4th time, C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner series, which I think is a very, very impressive accomplishment. I've also been reading recently Barbara Hambly's vampire books, which amazingly enough are good stories, even though they're about vampires. In fact, I was thinking of doing a blog post on the subject of how a virtuous vampire would keep himself alive. the virtuous vampire, figures out people who ought to be killed, murderers and things like that, and he just feasts on them, which I thought was, because part of what's interesting about the Hamley books is that her vampires are not always all that sure that they should be vampires. They just don't have any choice anymore unless they want to die. And so you have vampires, some of whom are in some dimensions fairly likable people, despite the fact that they're killing about one person a week. And of course, from the standpoint of the non-vampire characters interacting with them, that creates a moral problem. How do you deal with the fact that this person who on the whole is cooperating with you and doing jointly desirable things, who seems to be a sort of on the whole, an honorable and intelligent person, also is a multiple murderer routinely. So anyway, those are quite good stories. I've just finished the third of them. I think there are about 8 of them, so they'll keep me going for a while. Other things, I think that Bujold, both science fiction and fantasy, is very good. There are various of the earlier people I read as well, but if I think of people who are still writing, that probably Bujold and Cherry would be my 2 favorites. And for Cherry, it's both fantasy, I guess fantasy and science fiction, and for Bujold also. That probably Bujold's best single book is a fantasy, but then she's got a long series that's very good science fiction, the Vorkosigan Saga. Curse of Chalian is her really good fantasy book. But other things, Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, I thought was really neat. And her dragon books are fun, although I think not as good. But she's got a series which are basically the Napoleonic War with dragons, which she has a good deal of fun with. The physics doesn't work, of course, but you can't get large flying dragons, unfortunately, not on Earth's gravity. Unless they're lighter than aircraft, which these ones are. But they're still good stories. Anyway, so I read lots of science fiction, but I don't watch movies. I've watched almost no movies. I think I saw either 1 or 2 of the Star Wars movies a long time ago. And I watched the movie of the Fellowship of the Ring, and I thought it was better than I expected, but not good enough to make me want to watch the second and third one. I thought there were some things that were clearly wrong about it. I should say, I started reading Lord of the Rings early enough, so I had to wait for the second volume to be published. So that would have been sometime in the 1950s, I think. And I've read it many times.
Oh yeah, I mean, you've got to read Lord of the Rings multiple times. It's a brilliant series. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but Lil Bill wants to know what your thoughts around cyberpunk are. The latest game. I
guess it depends what you count as cyberpunk. I'm sure I've written some things that get described that way. Trying to remember. I think, doesn't Melissa Scott have some? I'm trying to remember. But the answer is it's certainly not something that I specialize in, and I think you'd have to point at particular books that I might have read that might be classified as cyberpunk.
Okay. We have there's a tradition around here for our user Mike to ask this question. So, would you rather fight a lion or a cheetah?
What do I have? What are my weapons?
Your bare fists. You just have your fists and your.
The answer
wits.
is no.
You'd not fight either of them?
You said, would I rather fight a lion or a cheetah? No, I would not rather fight a lion or a cheetah.
Okay, yeah, you found the loophole in Mike's question.
But I think you'd really have to specify that my guess is that with my bare fists in an open field, I'm dead either way. And once you either give me ways of getting away, I don't know how fast lions are. Cheetahs can certainly outrun me. Probably a lion can too. Or if you give me some kind of a weapon, if I've got a quarterstaff, my guess is that against a cheetah I would have some chance, and against a lion I wouldn't. Lions being much larger than cheetahs, although not quite as fast. But as they bare hands, it's not a very interesting question, I don't think.
Okay, that's all right. I'm not quite sure what the context behind this question is, but Power asks, do you think your camel is slower than mine?
he's thinking of a puzzle that I have a long time ago. It's something that I use to explain why it's sometimes possible to engineer around market failure. And the answer is, I don't know, but I know how to find out.
Okay.
The way we find out, other people, I won't have heard it. So it's the following idea. Two Bedouins are riding their camels through the desert, and the oasis is a couple of miles away. And one of them starts complaining about how slow his camel is. And he says, this snail, which is called a camel, has got to be the slowest camel in all of the deserts of Arabia. And the other one says, you think your camel is slow? This rock I'm sitting on. And they get into an argument about whose camel is slower. And they agree to bet a golden dinar on which camel will get to the oasis last. And you can see what happens, that one of them starts going slowly and the other one starts going more slowly because he wants to win the bet. And eventually, an hour later, they're sitting stock still in the blazing sun on their camels with the oasis still 1.5 miles away. And at that point, a wise man comes walking along and he says, why are you two idiots sitting stock still on your camels in the blazing sun with the oasis 1.5 miles that way? And they get off the camels to explain the problem. And the wise man says 2 words to them, and they leap back on the camels and ride off as fast as they can for the oasis. And the question is, what are the 2 words? And the answer, of course, is the 2 words are trade camels. When each one is riding the bet is about the camel, not the Bedouin. So when each one is riding the other one's camel, he wants it to go as fast as possible so that he can win because his camel will get there last. That's what that question is about. So the answer is that I find out by making such a bet and then trading camels.
Oh, that's brilliant. We have a question from Bing Bong. What caused back to the libertarian questions, I suppose. What caused you to become an anarcho-capitalist rather than a libertarian like your father?
Yeah, part of the answer is a book by Heinlein called "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress." That basically my view, say at 15, was that the laissez-faire market was the best way of running the economy, but it had to be done within a framework of a legal system provided from the outside. So that was why you needed a government. Sort of fairly standard minarchist libertarian view. And I thought that I sort of had a theorem I could prove, though I never actually made it explicit, showing that it had to be done. And Heinlein in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress gives a believable description of a society where the legal rules are endogenous, where there is no external power, and yet there are enforced legal rules. And as far as I could tell, it was an internally consistent description. A theorem is refuted by a single counterexample. So if he had really described a possible society that worked that way, then my general principle couldn't be right. And so that started me thinking about how you would manage a society in our world, rather than his fictional moon, in which there was private property and ordinary rights enforcement and such, but no government. And that's what Machinery of Freedom came out of. Now, I would say now that part of my argument for it, part of my argument with minarchists, is that most libertarians believe that governments are bad at producing things. That if you have the government in charge of producing food, your food is not going to be very good and you might have a famine, and similarly for other things. Legal systems are not, designing a legal system is a non-trivial problem. That if you've actually been a law student or tried to look very seriously, it's all very well to have, a few sentences of general rules, but then when you think of actually applying them, it gets much more complicated. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that if the government designed the legal system, it'll do a good job. The same problems are going to occur that occur with governments doing other things. That I believe I have sketched a set of institutions in which you have market production of law, and it's not as neat and clean as the standard market production of goods, because the legal rule between me and you is also a legal rule between you and me. So there's an element of bargaining that doesn't normally exist on a sort of a well-functioning market. but I've at least argued that the logic of that system is going to be like an ordinary market, to tend to generate economically efficient law. And I think that's better than you can reasonably expect from any political mechanism. So that would be, now, I have some sympathy with the moral argument for anarchy, which was sort of my part of the problem I had with my original position, that it's hard to morally justify taxation. But I think that what really convinced me was more saying you don't have to have government doing these things, and there are reasons to expect them to be done better without government.
Okay, we'll go through only a few more questions. This question comes from Power. He asks, what was it like growing up with a famed economist for a father, and how would you say your father influenced your way of thinking? So just going back on.
I would have said that when I was growing up, I didn't think of my father as a famed economist. I think the first point at which that got through to me was at some point fairly far along in high school, maybe senior year, where I should say I went to a high school that was run by the University of Chicago. So a lot of the people there had university connections. And I said something to one of the other students to the effect of, my father's an economist. He says, "Oh, of course we know that," or "Of course I know that." And at that point, I think was the point at which I became clear that he was not only an economist, but a pretty famous one. Other than that, I would say that growing up with the parents I had was wonderful. That going back to Ayn Rand for a moment, my theory of what was wrong with Ayn Rand was that she had the bad luck to grow up with nobody as smart as she was around her. And she therefore came to the natural conclusion that when people disagreed with her, it was because they weren't bright enough to understand her correct arguments. I did not have that problem. And so in that sense, having the parents I did was very desirable benefit. In addition, I think they were wonderful people. That my father and I argued with each other a lot. And the question was always who had the better argument, not who was older. At some point, I heard my father-in-law say to my son, his grandson, who was, I don't know, 11, 12, something like that, "You shouldn't contradict your elders." Now, my grandson, I think, was wrong in whatever he had just said that was causing this response, but my view was that that was blasphemy. That, of course, you should contradict your elders if you think they're wrong, and then if they're right, they should be able to show you why they're right. And that was sort of the attitude that I think I grew up with, that I've tried to bring up my children with, and that was a very fortunate one. I thought that having the parents I did was great. And beyond that, I learned lots of economics, not in a formal way, but because that's one of the things we talked about. Lots of other things as well, I suppose. One disadvantage, however, was that I ended up expecting people to be honest. And when I was a grad student, I spent a summer as a congressional intern. And the congressman I was theoretically interning for lent me 4 days out of 5 to the Joint Economic Committee. And the Joint Economic Committee lent me to the Committee on State and Local Finance of the Joint Economic Committee, which was also the Committee on State and Local Finance of the Governor's Conference, and which was also the Project on State and Local Finance of George Washington University. It may have had a couple of other hats too, I'm not sure. So I was working with them. And they were producing a fact book on state and local finance, which was supposed to tell the sort of lay reader the things about state and local finance that he needed to know. I came across a fact. It was an unquestionably true fact because it was a demographic fact about people already born. It was unquestionably important because it was about the largest budget item of state and local governments. And they refused to include it in their fact book because it had the wrong implication. Its implication was that they needed less money, not more money. And I found that shocking, the fact that professional academics would deliberately bias what they included in what was supposed to be a fact book in order to make people reach the right conclusions. And thinking about it later, I like to describe that as my loss of innocence. But thinking about it later, I concluded that part of it was that I'd grown up in a bubble where it was just assumed you didn't do that. So that was, in some sense, an advantage, in some sense, a disadvantage of the upbringing I had.
No, that's great. It's always nice to have a parent that goes back and forth with you and treats you like an adult and discusses politics or economics with you. One of our questions comes from Rel, and he asks, what do you think about private prisons and without government? What is the incentive to punish or rehabilitate people for committing crimes?
Yeah, it's hard to know in a anarchist system what the details of what it does are going to be. Just as hard to predict how a market will produce anything. And there are obvious reasons why you would like, if possible, to use fines rather than imprisonment, because imprisonment costs money and fines are just a transfer. You can't always do that, though, given that not everybody is in a position to pay them. So I guess the proposal I made a long time ago, and I was really thinking more nearly in our system, and it's one with potential problems, was a legal system where every sentence takes the form of X years or Y dollars. And assuming you don't have Y dollars, you have a choice of spending your X years in a government prison or accepting a bid from a private prison, which is going to have you working in the prison, but will pay off your fine at some amount per year. And that the result of that then private prisons can compete. You've got the option at any point of saying, I want to go back to the government prison instead. And therefore the private prison has an incentive to make life as pleasant for you as it can while maximizing its profit. That is, obviously it wants to spend as little money on you as it can and get as much work out of you as it can, but it's got to do better for you than any other private prison. And on paper, that's a nice system, but it has some potential problems. And when I discussed it a long, long time online, this was probably, might have been on Usenet. This was, again, maybe 30 years or more ago. And somebody said, yeah, the British had that system for the colonies in Africa. When they needed a road built, they would arrest a bunch of the locals on some excuse and then say their sentence was to work on the road. So you have to worry about the fact that in such a system, punishing people can be profitable. And therefore, people will be spending resources trying to get excuses for punishing other people, and other people are spending resources trying to stop them, and that's a dead weight cost. And of course, that's a problem we're familiar with in terms of the tort system at present, that you worry that you will have people who are looking for deep pockets to sue rather than people who have really done wrong. So it depends in part on how well, on to what degree you can trust your court system not to convict people who are innocent, essentially, or not to overstate the things. And presumably, in my private competitive market system, we're going to do better than our political system, because after all, the fact that if I am convicted of such and such an offense, something will happen to me, is one of the terms of what my rights enforcement agency is selling me, that they have agreed that if the court finds that I really stole from you, you can make me work it off and pay them $1,000 or something. And so they have an incentive to take account of my interests as well as of the interests of the potential victims of my crimes. So in principle, I think the answer is that in a perfect information world, that is the right answer. A perfect information private enforcement world, but I don't really know to what extent, given the real problems, its difficulties would be greater than its advantages. I should say that I wrote all of this up in one of my published journal articles, where I was making the point that on paper, it always made more sense to have fines rather than imprisonment. And the problem was that you then have an incentive to convict people whether or not they're guilty, and more incentive. And it turned out that people were asking about science fiction. It turned out that the argument that I published in a respectable journal article in Law and Econ was made by Larry Niven in a series of science fiction stories long before I wrote that article. That Niven has, the first of the stories is one in which it's moving a little bit forward from when it was written. And it's describing how it occurred to people that there was an organ shortage. And it was really awfully wasteful if you're going to execute somebody anyway to then throw away all of his good organs. And therefore, one country after another made a rule saying that if you were convicted of a capital crime. You got executed, but you got executed with all useful organs forfeiting and then being available for people who needed organs. Sounds like a wonderful idea. Nobody's worse off. The guy would be executed anyway, and here you're saving lives. But then, of course, once you do that, there is an incentive to try to execute more people because there's a shortage of organs. And how do you execute more people? Well, he doesn't actually describe getting people who are innocent. What he describes is making more and more crimes capital. And you discover at the end of the short story that the protagonist who is awaiting execution has been convicted of, for the third time, driving in such a way as to endanger human life. So 3 strikes and you're out. And he then has a bunch more stories set in that future. But he's got the basic point, which is that you have to think about the incentives, both of the criminal and of the enforcers. And that's sort of the mistake in a lot of economic analysis of government activities, is they're thinking about it, assuming that the government that's making and enforcing the rules is just trying to do good, rather than trying to think about the incentives of those people. And that is equally true in this case, where you've got to think about what the incentives are of people who are making the laws or enforcing the laws and so forth. And that's a problem if you make punishing people profitable.
Okay.
Hope that helps a little bit. Like many issues, it's a complicated question.
Of course, of course. We'll make this the final question. You've been very patient with us, so thank you. Zulu wants to know what your opinion on intellectual property rights are.
Yes, I think I may be the only libertarian in the world who isn't sure whether it's a good or bad thing. I think that there are, the part I'm pretty sure of is that copyright law has expanded too far. That is to say that copyright law applying just to literal copying of text is at least arguably a good thing. How essential it is, I'm not sure, but it's arguably a good thing. Copyright law, when it can be used for sort of look and feel kind of stuff, ends up using copyright law for stuff that looks an awful lot more like patents, like ideas rather than expression, take the old distinction. And I have a chapter in my book, Law's Order, which is discussing these questions. But more generally, there is a good book which argues, I'm trying to remember the title of it, Against Intellectual Monopoly, I think, title like that, which argues that both patent and copyright laws are a mistake, and makes a pretty good case, though it's a fairly one-sided case. But there are obviously arguments in favor of them as well. As far as I can tell, most libertarians either believe, as Ayn Rand did, that intellectual property is the most defensible kind of property, or else believe, as many other libertarians do, that it's the least defensible. And I'm not on either side of that. I think there are actually reasonably good arguments. I think that a world without intellectual property would still be a tolerable world. I think there are other ways in which you can get rewarded. And we've observed that as intellectual property has become unenforceable in various ways due to the internet and to the fact that a lot of IP is in digital form, people find other ways of getting themselves paid. But it may be that we'd be worse off, might be better off, I don't know. My guess is that if we didn't have the FDA enormously increasing the cost of developing drugs, that you could probably develop medical drugs all right without patent law, just because of first mover advantages and the like. But given that we do have that and that developing drugs is very, very expensive, I'm not sure you could do it without patent protection.
Brilliant. Okay, so I'd say that's a wrap on the questions. I'd like to thank you for coming on onto Blue Politics again. It's been I'm glad you've had the patience to deal with some of our technical issues at the start, but yeah, I speak on all of us. I think you answered all of the submitted questions beautifully, and hopefully at some point, if you're down for it, maybe at some point you would be happy to come back, but that's ultimately up to you.
As you can observe, I like talking.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It gives a really in-depth answer. It gives in-depth answers to anyone who submits them, and I think Just looking at some of the channels, some people are very satisfied with their answers. Some of them even took to writing them down with joy. But yeah.
Is this going to be available online? Because if so, I may want to put a link on my webpage to it.
Sure, yeah. It'll be available on our YouTube channel. I'm sure.
Email me the link when it exists.
Yep. Okay, brilliant. We'll do that. And as for everyone else, we're going to go over to the Politics 1 VC so we can discuss the AMA or like discuss whatever political issue you want. And yeah.
All right. Thank you. It was fun. I still don't have a very good idea of how to use Discord, but at least a little bit better of an idea than I did before. So
okay. That's fine.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.